Hi everyone. Yes, so I am Ollie McDonald. I'm going to be talking to you about something a bit different from that Gravity talk. So I'm going to be talking about creating cinematic quality visual effects in real time. So just in case you've never heard of it, Killzone is a renowned FPS, an award-winning FPS series renowned for its excellent visuals and effects. It spans 6 titles over 5 PlayStation platforms. The 2 most recent titles are Killzone Mercenary, that's a PlayStation Vita exclusive, that's made by us here at Guerrilla Cambridge, and Killzone Shadowfall, which is a PS4 launch title. That was made by our sister studio, Guerrilla Amsterdam, although we at Guerrilla Cambridge have taken over post-release multiplayer maps. So I'm just going to give you a short clip just to get a feeling of what the game is, and just to show you some of the cool effects.
The ends justify the means. They may say differently to common folk, but you and I understand that this is the reality of life. And it begins with your destruction!
Stand up to this barbarism.
So, yes, as artists, we're always trying to hit the best visuals possible. So, even though we're running at real time, we really want to hit that cinematic quality visual bar, sort of comparable to film. But obviously, we have massively different resources. So in film, everything's pre-rendered, you know. You could spend hours simulating an explosion. You could spend hours rendering your explosion. By comparison, if we're rendering it real time, when we're running our multiplayer, we have to run things at 60 frames a second to keep everything nice and smooth and responsive. That means everything in our scene has to be rendered in 0.016 seconds per frame. That's not just the effects, that's every single thing that is there. So obviously, that's a massively different budget. Now, I'm just going to briefly touch on some kind of technical stuff, but you might be aware, generally we have a CPU and a GPU. We have a CPU which handles things like our AI, our script, our physics, and actually drawing our meshes. For particles, we're talking about the particle positions and collisions. The GPU is running surface, lighting, and post-process things. This runs the shaders for our particles. And we also have to fit everything into strict memory limits. So we can only have a certain amount of memory that holds everything that we need to play. On top of that, when we're making effects, we have to keep within gameplay requirements, like fitting the visual explosion of a grenade to its damage radius in-game. So fitting within all of these constraints, as well as creating this sort of cinematic quality visuals, is really quite a feat. But I think the Amsterdam Effects team really nailed it when they released Shadowfall. Indeed, they were nominated for a VFX Society Award for real-time effects. I'm just going to talk a bit about what a sort of typical AAA game development effects team is. So we got 10 members in the team in all. They span various different specializations. We got 2 Houdini specialists who a lot of their job was looking at fracturing buildings, so actually breaking them apart so that they can crumble. Like, I don't know if you saw the sequence where it's swooshing and things were falling down. And as well as that, they had dedicated tool support and 1 guy dedicated to just working on cutscene effects. I came into the project, I worked over in Amsterdam just for the last few months to help them finish everything off. And then, like I said, we've taken over the post-release multiplayer development, some maps and some game modes. So I didn't necessarily make all of these effects, but I know how they work, and I'm going to share some of the cool tricks with you. So let's jump into a really exciting one. An explosion! Everyone loves explosions. Where's my mouse? This is the sort of thing, this is made in Houdini, which is one of the tools we use. This is a pre-rendered explosion. You can see how flexible Houdini is. You can make an explosion be really fiery, be really smoky. You know, you can make it however you want. But the problem with this is this takes ages to simulate and render. This particular simulation here, which isn't like that big, you know, it's nothing the sort of scale you see in Gravity, but this particular one takes several minutes. It's 30 million voxels, which is a big number. It takes several minutes per frame to just simulate that, and then that little clip there took over 2 hours to render. By comparison, so running in real time, we go from several minutes and 2 hours, you know, to less than 1 millisecond, so 0.001 millisecond. So that gives us a rough budget for just one explosion of, say, 400 particles. So with that massive disparity in what we can do, how can we get that cool pre-rendered behavior into game? So obviously, the answer is to combine our pre-rendered things into real time. So here is the generic grenade explosion from Shadowfall. So you throw a grenade, boom. So you can see there, in the center of that explosion, you've got the cool, growing mushroom cloud with its fieriness and its smokiness. And then on top of that, you've got all little bits of sparks and debris, and they're all flying around everywhere. So the main actual smoke cloud is only one particle. So we sort of cheated it down from 30 million to 1, which is a good trick. So we've got to think about sorry. So it's not revolutionary to put a pre-rendered sequence into game, but we've got to consider the constraints that we still have placed on us. So even if we just rendered out that sequence and we just wanted to put it in game, say it was to last 6 seconds, we'd need 360 frames for that to look smooth at 60 FPS. To make that not look pixelated when it's close up on screen, we need each frame to be like at least 300 pixels across, preferably more. If we laid all these out on a sheet, so in order for the game to stream these textures in real time, we need to lay everything out on a big Power of 2 sheet. So if we laid all of these out on a big Power of 2 sheet called a flipbook texture, that'd be over 8,000 pixels. That is a massive texture. Uncompressed, that is 250 megabytes in size. Now, one of the great advantages of going on the PS4, next gen, as they call it, is we've got 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's 4 better than Xbox One, by the way. And 250 megabytes might not seem like a lot on that, but what we've got to consider is that every single discipline is vying for memory space. Once you've got all of your models, textures, and animations in, you know, everyone's competing. And when we jump up to next gen, everything gets higher resolution. So here's a Helghast Trooper from Killzone 3. This was on the PS3. He looks kind of cool, but if we jump up to PS4, this is the Helghast Trooper from PS4. You can see like a massive increase in detail. All those tiny little nicks and stuff, all those extra detail textures everywhere. All of this increase in resolution comes at a cost of higher memory. So every single discipline needs to try and minimize their use of memory. And how can we do this? Well, we need to minimize the number of frames we can use. And how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to use a technique similar to video compression. Basically, we're going to take the pixels of one frame, and if they're in a position in the next frame, we're going to blend them along their motion vector to reach the next frame. I'll show you what I mean. I'm sure you've probably all seen this when you're watching a video. So you've got one shot playing, and then all of a sudden it will change to the next shot, but you'll only get like certain parts, the parts that are moving, doing this. This is because it's cheaper to store like a video like this when you're compressing it, to store the motion vectors that blend pixels along a vector than it is to store each individual frame. We're just going to use a sort of similar technique to this. So here's a little clip from Killzone 2. This is an old Killzone thing. They wanted to get a giant growing mushroom cloud into their game for a nuclear explosion sequence. Now, this was originally 3,200 frames, but what they did was they took the footage, they tracked the motion vector, so you can see there the shape that a motion vector is, and then they have that information so that they can go from 3,200 frames down to just 16 frames. 16 frames, each with a motion vector, that blends it. So if you look closely at there, you can see that this mushroom cloud is growing and changing. It's always shifting shape. So that's exactly what we've done with our explosion for our grenade. We have on the left here, we have our color. So this is just a render out of Houdini that shows what a lit explosion would look like. And on the right here, these are the motion vectors. Now, it looks kind of crazy, but if we just look at one up closer. So this picture on the right has all the information you need to go from this frame on the left, so it is the middle one in there, to the next frame along. I'm just going to go over how you do that. Sorry. So, no, I'm just going to go next frame. So how do we do this? What we need to do, right, normally we're going to take this texture and we're going to put it onto a particle. So this is a particle. It's called a sprite because it's got 4 pixels. I don't know, maybe. But this is a sprite, and how we're going to do this is we're going to lay it out on this sheet. Now, it might seem like a very simple thing just to stick that on there, but you've got to think about sort of the maths behind it. So normally we've got coordinates. So on the left is 0, on the right is 1. That's called our u coordinate horizontally, and that we can visually represent with like a gradient. So 0 to 1. So any pixels that are given this black map when we're mapping them on are on the left. Any that are given the white are on the right. Same with our VRAMP going vertically. Now, if we just wanted to visually represent both of these at the same time, it would be very difficult to see. We just get this sort of boring gradient. So what we do instead is we give one red and one green. This is because if you're storing like a 2-vector channel, no, I'm not going to go into that. Sorry. This is what it looks like. It's cool. It's bright and colored. If you look at our motion vector, you see you've got the same colors going on. And again, if we were to break that down, you see you've got single channels. So just like our U and our V are single channels there, we've got single channels, one for the U, one for the V. So this one in the middle here is going to influence how far the pixels are shifted to the left or the right. And the one on the right is going to influence how far the pixels are shifted up or down. So if we were to take our U ramp and overlay it onto a normal, boring, completely straight left to right ramp, we would see that some pixels would get darker, they would shift to the left. Some pixels would get brighter, they'd shift to the right. If we do that with both our channels at once, you see that what will happen is some will go up and to the left, and some will go down and to the right, and that's how you get this rolling motion that's more complicated than just shifting in one direction. I probably lost you all there. I know, it's fine. Just, it looks cool. It's exciting. So here is an explosion that I've taken. This has just 25 frames. We've slowed it right down so it lasts 6 seconds. And yet, even though it's just 25 frames over 6 seconds, it should be 360 frames. You can see it's really nice and smooth during the whole duration of it. Okay, so that was exciting. But so why do we render stuff out of Houdini? So I showed you a clip where they tracked a nuclear mushroom cloud. Now, if we render stuff out of Houdini, we can get more accurate motion vectors. We know precisely the difference between one frame to the next, so it gives us more accurate vectors. But another thing we can do is render out different parts of the simulation separately. So in this explosion, I'll just show you it again. You note at the start, it's all fiery. So, yeah, cool, fire. If we go to the next frame, we have the exact same explosion, but this one will just be all smoky. So you've lost the fire in between those two. Now, this is the same simulation, so I don't have to do a second simulation out of Houdini to get a smoky one. What we've done is we've rendered out the simulation once as a smoky thing, once as a fiery thing, and then we've recombined them in our shader to give us a shader that is flexible, that we can change how we want when we author our particle effects. So I'm going to just show you a shader really quickly. That's what I was saying. Now, this looks kind of complicated, but don't worry about it. Basically, the top bit's sort of blending between frames. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't touch on that. But when we finish blending one frame to the next with our motion vector, we blend to the next frame visually. And then we blend that one along its motion vector and blend to the next frame. So we do this for all 25 frames. So at the top there, that is what that section is doing. And then we're adding onto it our fire. don't really worry, but all you need to know is the little orange nodes, they're switches. And these switches will let us change what the shader looks like as we are authoring the particles. So I'm just going to go on some other uses of motion vectors. Here's a river. This uses the same. So we've got one frame visually, which is just what the river looks like. And then we've got a motion vector, which is just sort of smearing it that way. And then we just loop it out. So you get this riverbank, the water splitting around a break in the riverbank, which would otherwise be very, very difficult to do. Another one here, this is petricite. It's like some sort of fake element from the fiction, but it's got a cool sort of wispy, plasma-y feel. So again, we're just using motion vectors to smear the pixels around, and then we're fading to another version of it in a loop. And that way we get this cool behavior, and each of these is only one particle. Well, each of those things. Yeah, you also see the force fields here, which are really awesome, cool render tech. I'm not going to talk about that, but... So, I've talked about how we get really high quality, really high quality visual effects into game, or behaviors that would otherwise be very, very difficult to do. But now I'm going to talk about how we get it to all run well. I'm failing this presentation hard, sorry. So we've got three broad areas that we optimize in. The CPU, the GPU, and memory. I talked about them briefly earlier, but I'm going to look at each one a bit more in depth. So our CPU, as I said before, it handles AI, script, physics, and physically drawing the meshes. For particles, we're talking about emitter behavior and the actual positions of all of the particles. On top of that, we take particle collision. So in the grenade I showed you earlier, little bits of debris were flying and bouncing off the wall, and sparks were bouncing everywhere. That's particle collision. So what do I mean when I say an emitter and a particle? So if we look at this thing here, you can see we've got like this laser welder. Now, the actual point that's shooting, that's one emitter. That's shooting a little beam out. The point that's spraying sparks out, that is also an emitter. So we've got two emitters there, basically. And each of these little points is a particle. So generally, there's an overhead cost of having each emitter in our scene. And there's also cost increases with the number of particles we have. So how can we optimize this? Well, there's three main ways we do this. The first is by setting up levels of detail, or LODs. So I'm just going to show you a quick example here. When we are close to this, we want to see all of the detail. But when we're further away, we don't really care so much about the detail. So when the camera shifts back, the smaller sparks disappear. And when we shift back even more, the actual spark stream that is near the base of the laser cutter will disappear. Now, I actually kind of broke this just to show you as an example. If you do this right, it's seamless. You know, I wouldn't cut it this close. I'd go like double the distance out where the sparks are very small. But it basically means that when you're far away from an object, you're not calculating a load of useless stuff that you don't need to use. The next one we have is setting up behavior in relation to the camera. So obviously, like I said, you don't want to render stuff when you're far away. You also don't want to calculate stuff if it's like behind a wall, if it's 100 meters behind you out of the camera view. So we can set behaviors on particle systems relating to how they behave related to the camera. An example, like a grenade, you'd always want to calculate because it's really important for gameplay to know where that is. But here's an example, again, with our laser welder. So this is a multiplayer level. This is kind of up on the side on the wall. So you'd think maybe we could turn it off when we're not looking at it. But the gameplay space is down here, and the art director's really insistent on having bouncing sparks everywhere because he thinks it's cool. So we have to make sure, even when it's off the camera, that the sparks are coming in out of the view and bouncing on the floor. Yeah. So the third one we can do is particle collision. So particle collision can get very expensive. It looks totally awesome, seeing little bits fly and bounce everywhere. And in fact, like, it's one of the good things about our engine is it handles it quite well, but it does get really expensive. You have to check the position of every single particle, every single frame. So what we can do, again, just like setting up our LODs, we can set a disable distance. So again, I've cranked this up so it happens a lot closer than you'd normally expect. But when the camera zooms out a little bit more, you see the sparks just start going through the floor instead of bouncing. So yeah, that saves a lot of calculations that you don't otherwise need to do. So if you set all of these things up right, like I said, it should be seamless. You know, the player should never notice that you're doing these. But this is a big process that all of the disciplines have to do. All of the meshes in the game will load down to lower resolution states when you're far away. We actually dedicate like a whole phase of development, once we're done making everything look cool, into trying to optimize it as best we can. But like I said, it should ideally be seamless to players. So let's look at our GPU. So GPU, as I said before, handles surface calculations, lighting, and post-process. For particles, we're talking about shaders. So what do I mean when I say a shader? Well, let's look at 2 examples. So on the left, we have our laser welder. And if we look at this 1 spark, that is 1 particle. But like I said earlier, this is also 1 particle. This is because we put most of the behavior of this smoke into a shader. But naturally, it's much cheaper for us to calculate what a little glow looks like than it is to do this cool motion vector blendy frame thing with our explosion on the right. I'm going to mention at this point that Killzone uses a deferred renderer. I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's really complicated. But all you need to know is it handles lots of lights a lot better. So for particles, this means we can have cool stuff like this where each of those sparks I showed you bouncing has its own tiny little light on the floor. Normally, this would be unbelievably expensive in a straightforward renderer, but because we sort of defer all our rendering, we can stick lights. Oh, I really can't explain it quickly, but another great example is that we can then feed that lighting information back into our particles, so we can have lit particles that are lit in our deferred renderer. So if you look at the swipe here, you take it off, those particles look really rubbish. These ones bed into the scene fantastically. So that's a really great thing about deferred rendering. Another brilliant thing is that, how can I explain it? You take your rendering, it's going on, you wait to do some of the rendering until later, we can stick some stuff in the middle that changes the properties of the materials. So here's a really great example. We want loads of dust in this level, like something's blown up. So normally you'd have to like make assets that have dust on them. But instead, because we've deferred, we can put a projection in that alters the materials of the ground before it's finished and change it to look dusty. Or here's another great example. We got this rain shader. So all the environment artist has to do to put this in the level is just put in a big cube and say, I want dust here, or I want rain here. And it saves them loads of time, and you don't have to duplicate meshes. So you don't have to have, here's a metal floor and here's a wet, rainy metal floor. You just have, here's a metal floor, and I've got an awesome cube which I just stick in here, which has rain on it. So how do we optimize the GPU somewhere? So optimizing the GPU, one of our biggest enemies is transparency. Transparency is incredibly expensive. Why is this? I'm going to run through it very quickly, but stick with me. If we're looking at this wall, like I said before, you don't want to render stuff that's out of your view. So if we just, here's a little zoom out. Zoom out from the player and look at what the player might be seeing. Wow, how exciting. That's our player there. He's looking at that wall. Now, his view frustum is something like this. So naturally, we don't want to render anything outside of the view frustum. So we just don't do that. On top of that, we're only really looking at this wall here. So we only actually need to calculate the shading information on the pixels of the wall directly in front of you. So basically, we're not calculating any of the shading information of this area behind the player's view. Now, if we take our viewpoint and then we stick a big smoke particle in front of it, we still have to render all of these pixels of the wall that we're looking at, but we also have to do additional calculations for every pixel that is behind the smoke, even if you can't see smoke in front of it because there's a big fat of sprite. I should have illustrated that. Because it's transparent. Now, putting one smoke thing in there might not be a big deal, but normally with particles, I say you have typically 400 particles, you could have like up to 30 layers of transparency. That's 30 additional calculations for every single pixel that has transparency in front of it. So how do we combat this? One of the ways we can do this is by using another great feature of our renderer is our half and quarter resolution buffers. So normally we're rendering our scene at 1080p, I can't remember, yeah, 1080p. But what we have instead is we have a half resolution version and a quarter resolution version. Now these buffers are normally empty unless you tell them to render something. But what you can do is render a smoke in your half res buffer and then recomposite it back into your main scene buffer, and you basically half the cost of that layer of transparency. If you quarter it, obviously you quarter it. On top of that, just like our LOD states, we can dynamically switch based on distance. So if smoke's far in the distance, you need to have it full resolution so you can see it clearly. But when you get closer up to it, you want to drop down to half or quarter res, and then you save a lot of rendering costs. So here's an example. This is really hard to see because the video compression kills it. But if you look really closely when I shift in, dink, there you go. We switch to half res, and then we switch to quarter. Normally, it's completely seamless to the players, but it drastically reduces the cost of that thing. Good. So where am I? The other way to do it is to simplify shaders. So the shader I showed you before was pretty complicated, but we need it to be complicated for having that nice motion vectors. It's always a balancing act when you're optimizing things between, do I add CPU cost by having additional particles? Do I add GPU cost by having a complicated shader? Or do I add memory cost by having additional frames in whatever I'm making? There's really no silver bullet when it comes to optimization. You just have to sort of balance things out and try to keep everything under budget. It's why I mentioned, you have to make sure every single thing's happy. If your CPU's over, if your GPU's over, if your memory's over, they're all going to bottleneck each other. So talking about memory optimizations, like I said before, reusable assets. By having one shader that has both smoky and fiery in, we can minimize the number of textures we use. The other way we can do this is by using all channels in a texture. Now, you might be a bit confused by what I mean. I'm briefly going to touch on that. So normally if we've got a picture of some exciting balloons, we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. So the red one tells you where in the image is red, the green one where in the image is green, the blue one where in the image is blue. But when we got something like smoke, the red, green, and blue are all exactly the same. It's just a gray image. So we don't need these channels. We're storing two sets of redundant data here. So what we can do instead is use them for useful stuff. So this is actually what our color looks like. I had pre-multiplied the alpha before to make it simpler, but you then need a mask. So this is what you'd multiply the color by to actually get what it looks like. And then the third thing you need is the fire. So that's what I talked about rendering out separately earlier. It looks like this. It's just a mask basically that goes on top. And then we'd recombine all these in our shader. Yeah, so that's what it looks like when you stick them all into one image. So you've got the alpha, the color, and the fire. And they look kind of funky over there, but what we do is we basically split them back out in our shader. So the red, which was our alpha, just goes straight in. That gives us a nice fluffiness on the bottom of the cloud. The green becomes all three channels of the color, and that gives us the gray. And the fire, which is the blue there, is multiplied by orange and then added onto our color, and that gives us the glowy fiery bits there. So that basically saves us on redundant data. On top of that, there's a cool Gorilla tool which will just optimize out and strip out any unused channels that you don't use. So in conclusion, having a small but diverse range of high quality assets and optimizing them to be as efficient as possible is how you get cinematic quality effects to run in real time. Hooray. I'm also going to do a shameless plug here, since you guys are some game art students. We have a 48-hour game jam on July 4th to 7th in Cambridge. You can win an internship at Gorilla Cambridge if you come in first place. We've got 2 of them going, or there are several tablets going. I have some postcards here. If you are interested, afterwards come and talk to me, or it's called brainseden.net. And do I have time for questions? Sure do. Does anyone actually have any?
So, questions? One at the back there.
Yeah, with regards to the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, say making a
Malcolm. I'm going to call my colleague up. I really do effects. Malcolm does sort of assets, and he probably knows about the limits on characters and stuff like that. So here he is. Big clap, or not.
You weren't expecting that?
No, not. Right, yeah, the high-res versions of the characters in Shadow 4, I think, are in the region of sort of 40,000 triangles. But we do use LODs a great deal, so you won't see those from any sort of distance. And it depends greatly on the actual makeup of the character. Really, triangle counts aren't that important to us. It's more shaders and sort of fill rates and things that cause frame rates to drop, that sort of stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, we can push around what's like millions of polygons quite easily. Like, it's a lot less of a limiting factor in this generation than last generation.
Cool. Another question? At the back?
Yeah, when you've got the grenade explosion at the sprite, when you move around it, doesn't it look odd?
Yeah, it does. We call that billboarding. Basically, like I said, when you're talking about optimizing, so in that one grenade I showed you, it's not going to come up anyway, but the one grenade has just one texture. It looks okay in 99% of the cases because it's quite quick. It just sits there and it goes up straight off the ground. The other explosion I showed you, one that was fiery and the one that was smoky, was made up of like 8 different sprites. And that means that the billboarding is a lot lessened. It is a problem, but there's no real solution to billboarding like that. You generally just add a few more particles and it won't look as bad. But like I said, it is always a balancing act between CPU, GPU, and memory to find what's best.
Cool. Time for one more question, if there is one. Oh yeah, over here.
Did you have to find different references for the ideas of the effects?
I mean, like I said, I didn't actually make those specific ones, but we do reference very heavily, like, no, I can't actually talk about that, that's a bit released.
Going and blowing things up in a desert.
Yeah, so I have a big folder called VFX Reference, and it's just got like explosions, fire, smoke, wind, ice. I always keep that with me, and I'm always expanding my library of reference for that because it's always really important. But I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's more important that it looks visually really cool than being realistic, you know? So it's always finding a balance between that as well.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.